Hello. So during this discussion, we talked about rating scales and measurement systems, performance-based pay. The first thing I wanted to talk on is just measurement systems. So you made a really good point of when we're figuring out what system we're rating or using to grade or score someone, you want to make sure that it's a valid system and that it makes sense and that it measures what it's intended to measure. We talked a little bit about performance improvement plans and how they can be punitive if they're not done correctly. So if someone has been engaging in a behavior and the first instinct is to put them on a PIP, they may say like, well, this is the first time I'm being graded or scored on this, and that can be very punitive. So when implementing things like performance improvement plans or corrective action plans or written warnings or whatever that looks like, you want to make sure first, how have we tried to reinforce the behaviors or mitigate barriers, right? So if someone makes a mistake and the first instinct is to put them on a PIP, this can be very punitive because they may think that you haven't taken the correct steps to try to help them improve or mitigate barriers or whatever that looks like. In my organization, we do a lot of general events. So basically documenting when we're having conversations or addressing minor issues. And for general events, we don't necessarily tell the person we're documenting it because it's not a form of corrective action, but it is a documentation for our sake and for HR's sakes that this has been an ongoing concern or ongoing issue. So for example, BCBAs are expected to do treatment integrity forms for RBTs once a month. And there's a situation with the BCBA where almost every month their TIs were not being completed. So we had many conversations, each month one or two were missing or maybe all of them were missing. So I would talk to the BCBA, I would ask them like, hey, like this is missing, like what's the barrier? What can we do to improve? And they're like, oh, like I forgot to do it or this happened or whatever the case is. So during those conversations, we troubleshooted to mitigate barriers, but at the end of the day, like the conversation was had and it was documented on my end. So after 3 months of things not happening, I was very clear. After the second month, I let them know like, hey, if this continues to happen, like it may lead to a policy review. So we sometimes find that, even though you're giving these warnings, the behavior still doesn't change, even as we're trying to mitigate barriers or having these conversations. So after about 3 months of it still not happening, we then had to move to a policy review, which is like one step before like a PIP or corrective action, but it is a form of documented communication. So once this policy review was given, obviously the BCBA was upset. They felt like, they were being written up for no reason and that there was no empathy. So I was able to kind of go back to those general events and say, hey, like we had a conversation on August 1st, August 15th, September 3rd, whatever the case is, and there was still no improvement. So that's helpful for that conversation, but also for the person who's delivering that policy review or PIP, because we have that documentation that we had conversations, we tried to mitigate barriers, and there still weren't improvements despite those conversations. And the challenge with giving corrective action is that it's never fun. Very rarely are people just okay with it and they just accept it and take it to the chin. There's always going to be some type of combativeness. So that's why it's very important for leadership to dot their I's and cross their T's and make sure that these things are documented, whether it's through a performance system or via email, via text, whatever that looks like, so that when you do deliver that final feedback, we have that documentation on file. We also wanted to talk about performance-based pay, and which is very common in the field, being a BCBA, getting paid for billable hours, especially if you're part-time and you're being paid hourly. That is incentivizing, right, to bill, and sometimes that leads to billing fraud or overbilling because you are getting paid at such a high rate. BCBAs are getting paid anywhere from $80 an hour to I've seen $110 an hour. So there is that incentive there. But my classmate made a really good point, when it comes to just quality and when you are getting paid so much to bill and these services, we start to see that quality go down. And even when BCBAs are getting paid for intake assessments. So I actually caught myself, because I do a lot of intakes for my part-time job where I'm doing 2 intakes a week, and which is not, it's a lot because it's not my main position. If I was just an intake specialist, that wouldn't be a lot. But for someone this is my part-time, that is considered a lot. And, you know, many companies give like 2 weeks to write the reports, but I've noticed some companies are now trying to expedite that process. So now you have like a report, you need to finish the intake report within a week, right? And there's a very big pressure on it. And since I do so many intakes and I'm familiar with the systems and the forms, that's fine. Like I am able to write a report within a week, but I could see how that pressure on another BCBA or like maybe a newer BCBA or less experienced BCBA can maybe push them to not focus so much on the quality, right? And just trying to push that out because there is such a push. And I actually found myself a few weeks ago making a few mistakes on reports that I typically don't make. So we have like a reviewer team that reviews them before we submit to insurance. And like one of the reports, like I forgot to attach the VB map, even though I did it, I just forgot to attach it. Or one of the reports I had like duplicated the graph where like I typically don't do that. So it's important for me as a clinician to realize those mistakes and realize when the quality is being jeopardized because the quantity is going up. And being able to, you know, advocate for myself and say, all right, you're taking on too much. What needs to backtrack so that the quality is of utmost importance? Or even like dropping cases when you feel like you're taking on too many cases. So performance-based pay is good in a sense that like it encourages people to take on more cases or more hours or whatever. So it's good from like an organizational level, but it can definitely impact the quality of care that we're delivering.